My cousin Sarah stole the entire inheritance of my uncle, and for this she went to prison for 15 years, and the entire inheritance went to. I never thought that simply opening my Uncle Frank's will would lead to such fierce disputes in our family. When the lawyer read out the contents of the document, a tense silence filled the room. Then, one by one, my relatives began expressing their outrage and disagreements regarding the distribution of the inheritance. Mom was beside herself with rage upon learning that her older brother Frank had inherited a large portion of the family ranch in Montana, which our grandfather had founded many years ago. "This is unfair," she shouted. "I worked just as hard on this land as Frank. Why does he get the better share?" Uncle Frank, usually calm and composed, couldn't contain his emotions this time. "Because I've been managing the ranch for the past 10 years while you've been stuck in the city," he retorted. Their argument was interrupted by my cousin Sarah's voice, who fervently declared, "What about the money from the sale of Grandma's antique furniture? The will doesn't say a word about who they'll go to." The atmosphere in the room became increasingly heated. I found myself thinking that soon the disputes might escalate into a full-blown family war over the inheritance. My fears were justified. The disputes quickly escalated into a real family war over the inheritance. Tensions reached a breaking point when Uncle Frank accused Mom of deliberately inciting other relatives against him. "You're the one who turned everyone against me. You've always been jealous that Dad trusted me more," he shouted, pointing at her. Mom was furious. "How dare you? I'm the only one who selflessly cared for Dad all these years while you only visited him occasionally." In an instant, the room descended into chaos. Aunts and uncles started exchanging insults. Cousins threw office supplies at each other. Even usually calm relatives were caught up in the general hysteria. In the midst of this madness, I suddenly noticed that Grandma's antique tea set, sitting on the mantelpiece, was dangerously wobbling, and then one of the cups fell down and shattered into pieces on the floor. There was a momentary silence, and then everyone erupted into an even louder frenzy. "See what you've done. A family heirloom is destroyed," someone's piercing cry rang out. The events that followed seemed like a blur. Someone called the police to calm down the raging relatives. When the officers took away a few particularly unruly uncles, I realized that our family nest had turned to ruins. Disunity, animosity, and greed tore us apart in the pursuit of inheritance. I felt devastated and shattered after the police escorted several unruly relatives. Uncle Frank was shocked by what had happened. He remained in place, stunned and incredulous that the peaceful family gathering had descended into such chaos. When things finally calmed down a bit, Frank stood in the middle of the room, surveying the aftermath of the wreckage: the shattered cup from Grandma's set, overturned furniture, shards of scattered trinkets. A range of emotions played across his face: disbelief, disappointment, bitterness. In that moment, I saw something break within him. This once vibrant and open man seemed to wither in age. A decade. In one evening there was a distant look in his eyes, as if he had seen through the facade of humanity. Without saying a word, Uncle Frank headed for the exit. Avoiding the shards of broken crystal in the doorway, he paused, casting one last despondent glance around the room. Apparently, in that moment, he realized that even blood ties were not a guarantee against greed and betrayal. People he had known his whole life had suddenly turned into strangers, ruthlessly tearing apart family bonds for their own gain. Without further delay, Frank left the house and got into his car. The next day, he sold his share of the ranch and left town for good, leaving no forwarding address. He chose to disappear and live in solitude rather than trust those who had stabbed him in the back in their pursuit of inheritance. I stood there in disbelief, watching Uncle Frank drive away after that insane evening, full of shouting, insults, and destruction. He looked utterly devastated. The family I had known all my life had suddenly shattered into pieces, torn apart by greed and animosity over inheritance. In the days that followed, I pondered what would become of Frank. He took with him most of the inheritance, the Montana ranch and the money from selling antiques, but he completely disowned his family, not even leaving anyone his coordinates. I wondered how Frank would start a new life somewhere else, alone, burdened by the disappointment of betrayal by his own kin. Would he ever trust anyone again? Or would he remain closed off and lonely, remembering how low human nature could stoop? At times, I thought it would have been better if he had just rejected the inheritance. Perhaps then the family would have remained united and we would have avoided this nightmare. But, on the other hand, greed had dug its claws so deeply into some relatives that they would have found a reason for discord anyway. I couldn't shake off the feeling of guilt for just being a bystander to the madness unfolding before my eyes and not doing anything to stop the destruction of family bonds. Perhaps if I had intervened, things could have turned out differently. But I just stood there, paralyzed, watching Frank leave everything dear to him, and I didn't know if he would ever come back. A couple of days later, the lawyer summoned us again to finally divide the remaining estate. Mom received a small sum of money from selling Grandma's antiques. However, it was clearly not enough to compensate for the loss of the ranch. She was gloomy and subdued, having lost the family legacy due to her own greed. Cousin Sarah, the one who first made a fuss about the antiques not bequeathed to her, ended up with a couple of trinkets. When the lawyer announced this, she literally flew into a rage, screaming that it was unfair, but her protests were ignored. She was left with nothing. As for me, the only inheritance I received was the sad outcome of the events of that fateful day. I didn't get a penny or a single item from the family estate, but I hadn't expected to. What was once my large and close-knit family had turned to ruins because of human greed. This loss felt much more painful than the absence of any material possessions. I felt only overwhelming emptiness, knowing that long-standing family ties had been trampled and thrown away for the sake of gain. My whole family had fallen apart, scattering the shards of mutual trust and respect, and I couldn't imagine if we would ever be able to gather those shards together again. Could Uncle Frank, with whom I spent so many happy days in childhood, really do this to me? I remembered how we wandered through the forest trails of the ranch, caught fish in the lake, baked pies from the old family recipe. Uncle Frank was my best friend and mentor during those years when my parents were too busy with work. He taught me to appreciate nature, hard work, and honesty. And now this man, who had been a modest rancher all his life, had disposed of a huge inheritance received from Grandpa, not even leaving me a penny. Did all our close memories and attachments mean nothing to him? Didn't he see how I always tried to be there, helping him with the chores? I would have expected that at least a small portion of the wealth would go to me, his beloved nephew, with whom he shared the most intimate moments. Instead, Uncle Frank chose to isolate himself from the entire family, taking the ranch entirely for himself, and then fleeing altogether, sparking endless disputes and animosity among relatives. He was far from poor and could have fairly divided the capital, but instead, he acted greedily, leaving us with nothing. Sitting amidst the shards of a broken and once united family, I didn't know what would happen next. One morning, there was a knock on the door. 2 policemen stood on the threshold. It turned out they were looking for Uncle Frank on suspicion of financial irregularity. It emerged that the money from the sale of Grandma's antiques had dubious origin, and it was quite possible that Frank was somehow involved in it. We told them everything we knew, how Uncle disappeared immediately after the will scandal, taking the bulk of the inheritance with him. The police took down our statements and the scant information we provided about his possible whereabouts. However, finding Frank proved to be difficult. He seemed to have vanished, severing all ties with us and the outside world. Perhaps Uncle settled somewhere in the countryside, in a small town, under a false name, hoping to disappear forever from the past. Perhaps what prompted him to take this step was not only the desire to preserve the inheritance but also the desire to escape possible legal persecution. Or maybe he just saw no point in maintaining relationships with a family that had so cruelly betrayed him. Part of me still wanted to believe that one day Frank would get in touch, realizing his mistake. After all, I have so many bright childhood and youth memories associated with him. But with each passing day, this hope dwindled. It seemed that Uncle had finally broken with the past and started a new life somewhere far away, possibly even abroad. Thus, my once large and close-knit family fell apart due to its own greed and distrust. I increasingly found myself thinking that it would have been better if the inheritance had never existed. After all, because of it, we lost the most important wealth, family ties and love for each other. The day started like any other. I returned from school, and Mom was still at work. Going upstairs, I decided to do my homework when suddenly I heard the key turning in the front door. At first I thought it was Mom coming home early, but then I heard muffled footsteps and sounds like someone rummaging through things. Peeking cautiously out of the room, I saw my cousin Sarah digging through Mom's closets and drawers. Memories of the recent inheritance scandal flooded back to me. I remembered Sarah screaming in frenzy that she got nothing. She must have decided to help herself at our expense. "Hey, what are you doing here?" I yelled at her coming down the stairs. Sarah literally jumped in surprise but quickly regained composure. "Oh, it's you. I'm just looking for something of Grandma's that rightfully belongs to me." "Oh, come off it. You got nothing in the will," I said angrily. "You're lying and trespassing in our house to steal." At these words Sarah completely lost her composure. "Steal? I'm just taking what's mine. Unlike you greedy selfish people. If it weren't for your stupid Uncle Frank I would," but she didn't finish her sentence. At that moment the front door opened again and a bewildered Mom appeared in the doorway. Her eyes darted from the ransacked closets to me and the now vanished Sarah. "What's going on here?" she exclaimed, grabbing her head. I opened my mouth to explain the situation, but Sarah suddenly darted out from the corner and rushed towards the exit, muttering only, "It's a misunderstanding, a misunderstanding." Thus our once close-knit family finally lost its sanity over the inheritance dispute. Loved ones once bound by the strongest ties turned into enemies ready to go to extremes for their own gain, and I became increasingly convinced that money is the most dreadful of human weaknesses. I felt completely devastated and broken. School, which used to come easily, became a punishment. My grades ominously plummeted. One day my homeroom teacher took me aside after class and advised me to see the school psychologist. She noticed a sharp change in my behavior and performance. At first I brushed it off, but then I figured that talking to a professional might not hurt. On the appointed day I stepped into the psychologist's office. For the first time she took just a few minutes to discern my subdued state and deep emotional trauma. I told her everything about the inheritance-fueled family turmoil, Uncle Frank's disappearance, the mutual animosity and greed that shattered once strong family bonds. The psychologist listened attentively and nodded in understanding. Then she explained that such situations, where money and material possessions are valued above human values, often lead to serious psychological trauma, especially in children and adolescents. She advised me not to internalize my feelings and worries, but to communicate more, spend time with friends, and engage in activities I enjoy. That should help me get through the crisis. A couple of days later, the psychologist informed the school principal about my family situation. Soon, my mom received a call asking her to come in for an important meeting. She was shocked to learn how bad things had gotten. Perhaps, at that moment, she truly reflected on the damage our uncontrollable greed in pursuit of inheritance had caused to our family. Perhaps, for the first time, she felt guilty for what we had been through together. But it was already too late to fix anything. However, one day there was a knock on the door. 2 police officers with grim faces stood on the threshold. It was immediately clear, they were not bringing good news. "It's about Frank Johnson, your relative," one of them began with a slightly trembling voice. "We received a message from a small town in Arizona. His body was found in the desert among the cacti." My legs went weak. I was expecting any news, but not this. Uncle Frank dead. The man who was my best friend and mentor in childhood. How could this be possible? The police officer went on to deliver the gruesome details. Apparently, Frank had been hiding out in a tiny backwater town all this time, but had kept most of the inheritance with him. He had substantial savings in bank accounts and a whole barn filled with antiques. However, for some unknown reason, Frank crossed the town's line and ventured into the desert alone. His body was found weeks later, partially torn apart by wild coyotes and parched by the scorching heat. His possessions, which he had fiercely guarded, were gone. Even his car had disappeared without a trace. We sat there, stunned by shock and grief. Frank had met such a terrible end alone, abandoned by everyone, possibly robbed and murdered by society's outcasts. What had he done to deserve such a fate? Tears welled up in my eyes as I remembered our last moments together. How Uncle looked at me with pain and disappointment. Before disappearing forever, did he realize he would never see his family again? That only a lonely death awaited him somewhere on the fringes of civilization? That day, our family mourned not only the loss of Frank but also the realization of how corrupt human desires can be when the thirst for money overshadows reason. Our senseless feud over inheritance led to a true tragedy, and I made a vow to never again succumb to greed, so as not to repeat the mistakes of the past. A couple of months later, the police announced that an investigation into Frank's death had begun. One theory suggested he was killed for robbery, as all his property and money had disappeared without a trace. In addition, it was revealed that shortly before his death, huge sums from the sale of antiques were transferred to Frank's accounts. However, the money never reached its destination, and the bank checks disappeared without a trace. All this led the investigators to consider the possibility of staging the murder and embezzlement of capital. Soon, our entire family was drawn into the investigation. We were summoned for questioning, and investigators sought any leads and evidence. During endless interrogation, shocking details came to light. It turned out that a few months before Uncle Frank's death, cousin Sarah had begun to lead a very extravagant lifestyle. She rented luxurious apartments, drove expensive cars, and bathed in luxury, despite not having significant income. Officially, that's when the investigators put forward the main theory: Sarah was somehow involved in Frank's inheritance embezzlement, and possibly even his murder. Her lavish spending could have been funded by these criminally acquired funds. Evidence began to pile up one after another. In particular, huge sums were found moving through dummy offshore accounts registered to Sarah, and then the police tracked down her hideout, an elite apartment near New York, where items from Uncle Frank's house and part of the stolen money were found. All this led to a real legal battle, in which cousin Sarah emerged as the main defendant in the murder and inheritance embezzlement case. As I listened to the accusations, I saw how this once sweet girl had turned into a monster, blinded by greed and avarice. It was bitter and shameful for me to realize that close family ties turned out to be so fragile in the face of human greed. Our family paid too high a price for material wealth that turned to dust in an instant. After months of legal proceedings, the day of sentencing arrived. The courtroom fell silent as the judge spoke. Sarah was found guilty of Uncle Frank's murder and embezzlement of his vast inheritance. The sentence, 15 years imprisonment. At that moment, I felt a mixture of shock, disgust, and some twisted relief. On one hand, I couldn't believe that this sweet cousin, with whom we grew up playing, turned out to be so vile, cruel, and greedy. She was willing to commit murder for money. Yet, Sarah was almost like a sister to me once, but on the other hand, finally uncovering the truth brought some relief to my tortured soul. Our family had been in the dark for too long, falling apart due to the inheritance feud and ongoing animosity. Now we knew the truth and could move forward. After the verdict, the judge announced another important decision. According to the law, all of Frank's remaining inheritance, including unlawfully acquired money from the sale of antiques, was to go to us, his closest relatives. At first, I just bitterly smiled to myself. These riches, the cause of such tragedy, were now returning to us, money tainted with the blood of an innocent man and soaked in the destruction of family ties. But on the other hand, finally uncovering the truth brought some relief to my tortured soul. Our family had been in the dark for too long, falling apart due to the inheritance feud and ongoing animosity. Now we knew the truth and could move forward. After the verdict, the judge announced another important decision. According to the law, all of Frank's remaining inheritance, including unlawfully acquired money from the sale of antiques, was to go to us, his closest relatives. At first, I just bitterly smiled to myself. These riches, the cause of such tragedy, were now returning to us, money tainted with the blood of an innocent man and soaked in the destruction of family ties. But then reality sobered me up. While these funds were acquired through dirty, criminal means, they were now desperately needed for our family's survival. After so many upheavals and financial expenses on legal battles, we were on the verge of bankruptcy. The returned inheritance would be a breath of fresh air, a chance to start over.